If the darkness be your God, little here shall you have of light, but shall leave it soon and come before me, to learn who lieth, Melkor, or I who made him. The great tales of the Legendarium are concerned with the wars and troubles of the west and north of Middle-earth, Quenta Silmarillion, the wars of Beleriand, Akallabeth, the downfall of Numenor east of Aman, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, east of sunken Beleriand, the Shire and Mirkwood found in the north, to Gondor and Rohan further south, but not to the far south, and Mordor, the land of shadow, as far east as the journey takes us, though that isn't where the map ends. The awakening of men in the east was the beginning of their first age, and after 300 years they began to appear in the west, starting a new chapter in their relatively short existence. As I have detailed in my videos, the Men of Light and the Men of Twilight, the second born undertook a journey west just as the elves did following their own awakening. Man journeying in search of not only the rumoured light of the west, but also to escape the sorrow, pain and evil of the darkened east, to attempt an escape from the Dark Lord Melkor and the men of darkness who served him, those who seemingly never turned from Melkor, and who would trouble Middle-earth throughout all of its ages. In this video I'm going to explore the men who mostly dwelt in the east and south of Middle-earth, with exceptions as always, those who fell under the shadow of Morgoth and would later welcome Sauron as their lord, the Men of Darkness. It is part of my series exploring what I see as the three main branches of men descended from the first men, a series that will hopefully answer questions such as which groups and realms of men willingly served Melkor. Are all men who are considered wicked or evil men of darkness? Why would these men serve Melkor? These questions and others will be answered through an exploration of these branches. Men of Light, the Edain; Men of Twilight, the Middlemen; Men of Darkness, the Wild Men. The words quoted at the beginning of this video are taken from the Athrobith Finrod Andrith, the debate of the elf Finrod and the woman Andrith, set at a later time in the history of the Elder Days. The words are attributed to none other than Eru himself, speaking to the first men who were falling or who had fallen under the corruption and lies of Melkor, the fallen Vala. Here we read the term Men of Darkness in its most ancient reference. Andrith speaks of the despair of men, fear of being abandoned by God, a possible loss of hope, or as she says, Estel, Sindarin for hope. Are we not cast off finally, or were we ever so? Is not the Nameless the Lord of the world? Say it not even in question, said Finrod. It cannot be unsaid, answered Andrith, if you would understand the despair in which we walk, or in which most men walk, among the Atani as you call us, or the Seekers as we say, those who left the lands of despair and the Men of Darkness and journeyed west in vain hope. It is believed that healing may yet be found, or that there is some way of escape. But is this indeed Estel? Speaking of the earliest days, it is quite easy to define Men of Darkness. It applies to men who fell under the dominion of Melkor during their early history, when Melkor walked among men in what Andrith calls the disaster. This is when Eru had spoken to men, urging them to learn and first be children before they grow to inherit the earth, letting them know they should walk before they run, and that this is the beginning of a long journey. This voice was understood by them before the creation of their own words. Eru would refrain from answering their questions fully, seldom speaking to them, again urging them to seek answers for themselves. A common theme throughout the entire Legendarium, allowing for the possibility of hardship and even suffering in order to learn, grow, and become greater in the end. Melkor, of course, took advantage of this, and his appearance would shape the future of mankind, their loss of trust and faith in the true voice of the one who had made them. Melkor appeared before them at a time when they were frustrated at their lack of understanding of this new world. Before even meeting elves and learning from them, he appeared in their own form, but greater and more beautiful, telling men that they should not have been left alone and uninstructed. A comforting voice seemingly removing any worries or despair they carried. He gave them the answers they sought, without them having to discover the answers themselves, and he promised them a world full of riches and knowledge they could unlock, if they would ask for it. You could have food more abundant and more delicious than the poor things that you now eat. You could have dwellings of ease in which you could keep light and shut out the night. You could be clad even as I. Then we looked, and lo, he was clad in raiment that shone like silver and gold, and he had a crown on his head and gems in his hair. "If you wish to be like me," he said, "I will teach you." Then we took him as teacher. This is often called Middle-earth's tale of original sin, or the fall of man. Melkor's corruption of mankind ran deep, so deep in fact that he convinced many of them that the voice of Eru was in fact the voice of the dark, a voice that wishes to keep them from him and to devour them. They grew to rely on him, and the world turned on man as they fell deeper into corruption, and as Melkor's power and hold over them grew. Weariness and hunger afflicted them even in the days of their youth. Fire and water turned against them. Birds and beasts shunned them or attacked them if they were strong. Plants poisoned, and the trees that man walked under freely were now feared due to the shadow beneath them. As they were corrupted, the earth itself began to reject them. At first, Melkor offered answers and gifts openly, but as his grip tightened, he began offering gifts only to those who swore fealty to him, who worshipped him openly in the temple they had constructed for him by his orders. Eventually, there were no gifts for all but the most devout, just worship and the binding of their will to him. Melkor declared that they were his, and must do his will, making excuses for their natural death that would inevitably come, something he had no control over, speaking of it as a way of limiting their population, to stop them from crawling like lice across the earth, as if he had power over death itself, another corruption of the gift that Eru had given men. Any who did not willingly serve him would feel his anger and would meet death sooner, in his own words. Now were all of these men men of darkness? No, for some finally understood that they had been deceived. Some of the brave and courageous among them realized that not only would Melkor not alleviate their suffering, but that he was the cause of it. They understood that he had lied, not the voice. As they said, "It is the Master that we have taken who is the darkness. He did not come forth from it, but dwells in it." They openly declared Melkor not as their god, but as their enemy. Their realization led them to escape from the east, becoming those groups we recognize later as the Edain or the Middlemen, depending on where their journey took them. Though some of these men who remained would later seek an escape, there are always exceptions. At this time in Middle-earth's history, the men of darkness were those who remained in the east under the shadow of Melkor, those who benefited from his lordship, and perhaps even those who were too frightened or subjugated to escape, considering it impossible, and later falling to darkness. It's a term for those men he showed some favour to for their open worship of him, and their cruel oppression of those considered weaker. Men of darkness who visited the house to receive gifts from a cruel god, obtaining forbidden knowledge they'd hold in secret. They grew in power and pride, seeking to enslave others, offering no rest from labour to any who were hesitant to devote themselves to their lord. And even Melkor's servants spread in the east and the south at this time, battling against each other and splitting to become separate tribes and clans. All under the shadow were men of darkness. And even when groups escaped and headed west to be free from the tyranny of Melkor and his followers, to seek a light in the west, he'd apparently already abandoned his followers in the east, dwelling in the west and north of Middle-earth in a war against elves, Melkor's enemies that were currently unknown to mankind. He abandoned them because his corruption of men in the east was seemingly complete. There was no need for him to physically remain and demand worship, because they freely worshipped him. They had given themselves to him after declaring, "Thou art the one great, and we are thine." He had blackened their hearts, and his evil had taken root, and would spread across the land even in his absence, an evil stain that would linger long after his defeat. As they grew in numbers, his followers would grow. Wicked men were now his fanatical subjects. Some would later remove themselves from the east, holding Melkor as their lord even in secret, in order to betray his enemies. Others feigned love for him and still sought an escape, but most would or could not be convinced to change their ways. This fanaticism would lead to ages of conflict against the enemies of the Dark Lord and the enemies of the second Dark Lord. The original Men of Darkness would have their descendants be born into a world where Melkor and later Sauron were considered gods, the enemies of their gods naturally becoming their enemies. The most infamous group that we tend to call Men of Darkness are the Easterlings. I won't outline their entire history here, but they have played a part in all the ages of Middle-earth. They are the quintessential Men of Darkness, and deserve to be discussed on their own. As you can probably tell by the name, this is a name generally used for men of the East, and not one particular tribe or group. When they appeared in the west of Middle-earth during the First Age, they were really called swarthy men, referring to the complexion of tribes that made this journey west. And we are told that some of these groups were secretly under the dominion of Morgoth, meaning they were most certainly men of darkness. Many were drawn west due to the rumour of its lands and waters, its riches, and its wars, as men of the east had developed a taste for conflict due to their own encouraged infighting. Though it's a misconception that all of them were servants of Morgoth, some genuinely had no love for the Dark Lord. Some men of the east arrived in the west and followed the sons of Fëanor, Maethros and Maglor. They were faithful and were said to cheat the hope of Morgoth. These were Bor and his folk, including his sons Borlad, Borlach and Borthand. They swore allegiance to these elves and joined the union of Maethros in the disastrous Nirnaeth Arnoediad, fifth of the great battles against Morgoth. They kept their loyalty and honour at the cost of their lives, slain by wicked men who did betray the Noldor. Bor was even honoured by the elves through the posthumous title of Faithful. The reputation of the various groups and tribes of men called the Easterlings as evil men comes from the treachery committed by most of the tribes who journeyed west at this time, not the exceptions like Bor and his folk. The treachery of those who swore fealty to the Noldor while serving Morgoth in secret. The most infamous would be Ulfang and his sons Ulfast, Ulvarth and Uldor. They joined with the elf Caranthir but betrayed the elves in the fifth battle. When Morgoth emptied Angband, it was Ulfang and his forces who turned on Maethros, as more Easterlings descended from the mountains to attack. Despite the traitors being slain, the damage was done, and the sons of Fëanor barely escaped, defeated, almost leading to the utter defeat of elves in Middle-earth. And after the War of Roth, the final conflict of the First Age which saw Morgoth defeated, the reputation of Easterlings never really recovered. They took part in that war, fighting for the Dark Lord against the West. In defeat, many fled and returned east, where it is said that they became lords over those men who had lingered there, those who had never abandoned their ancestral home. The role of the Easterlings in the Second and Third Ages only increased after the downfall of Morgoth. The Dark Lord's greatest servant, Sauron, began to grow in power in the Second Age. Sauron came out of hiding and revealed himself in fair form. For long he paid little heed to dwarves or men, and endeavoured to win the friendship and trust of the Eldar. But slowly he reverted again to the allegiance of Morgoth, and began to seek power by force, marshalling again and directing the orcs and other evil things of the First Age, and secretly building his great fortress in the mountain-girt land in the south that was afterwards known as Mordor. Until the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron was still using the disguise of a beneficent friend. He was journeying to Eriador with attendants, while secretly gathering armies. In Mordor he had secured the allegiance of men in adjacent regions. His emissaries were busy among the multiplying tribes of eastern men, but at this time Sauron did not allow them to face the Númenóreans or other men dwelling in the west. Even when Sauron was defeated in the War of the Elves in Sauron, he began to urge the men of the east to seek lands and spoils in the west. He didn't directly trouble the west for a while, but was still secretly extending his own dominions eastward, vastly expanding his forces and influence, while seeming quiet to those enemies who had defeated him. His influence grew and he became feared and worshipped as more than an emissary, but as a god-king to eastern tribes. And it is really in the Third Age where the strength of the Easterlings is fully realised. Even after another defeat for Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance, Sauron apparently appeared once again in the east, and those men he had dominated attacked the kingdoms in exile, battling with Gondor for territory, a rivalry and hatred that Sauron would, of course, use to his advantage. These tribes of the east had grown in number. The Wain Riders are established as a force of Easterlings in their own right, through the influence of Sauron, and they attacked the north. The Balcoth, another group that appeared and served Sauron, moved west to Kilnarthon, under the influence of Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery in Mirkwood. The Easterlings constantly increased their numbers, with more servants of Sauron arriving from beyond the Sea of Rhûn into the west. They had grown to form their own regions in the east, their own communities and kinds, with leaders, armies, bitter rivalries and hatreds, and Sauron as their god. The vast number of Easterlings used by Sauron in the War of the Ring, the conflict that led to the end of the Third Age with Sauron's final defeat, came through the Dark Lord once again uniting different peoples and lands to the east during periods of peace in the west, slowly but surely biding his time. The Easterlings had grown to revere Sauron and loathe the men dwelling in the west, something that I will discuss later as it's quite important. A hatred Sauron would fuel for his own needs, something he was able to achieve through the seed of darkness planted by Morgoth in the distant past, when the first men wandered in the eastern regions. These men had been used and abused by two Dark Lords for millennia, men of darkness who could not move from under the shadow of ambitious and tyrannical gods, gods they feared and revered as much as they later hated the men dwelling in the west. The Easterlings are not the only group spoken of as men of darkness. Various migrations occurred from the east in the First Age. I've already spoken of men escaping the darkness by journeying west, others choosing to move west after already having lived under the yoke of Morgoth. Not all those who left the east chose to wander west or north. As the men of the Shadow fought against each other in the east, they began to drift apart and separate, and men made their way to the south, to lands of sun and sand. The Haradrim, a Sindarin term meaning South people, is another group almost as infamous as the Easterlings. They were not really involved in the events of the First Age, but like the men of the East, they became heavily involved in the matters of Middle-earth in the Second and Third Ages. The men of the South found themselves exploited by the Númenóreans and by Sauron. Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings details the exploits of the Númenóreans on the coasts of Middle-earth, but it can be swiftly summarised by saying that the Númenóreans' attitude towards men on the mainland of Middle-earth changed drastically over the years. In the early years, the Númenóreans taught men of Middle-earth, being seen as wise and great men from across the sea, and they were, offering knowledge and technology. But as the shadow over Númenor grew during their own downfall, they became less benevolent. The men of Númenor, after constructing Umbar, would later use and abuse these men of the south, slavery, exploitation and sacrifice. The Haradrim grew to hate the men of the west, and why wouldn't they? Service under Sauron was much like the Easterlings, assured through hatred and ancient rivalries. Black Númenóreans held power, fallen men of the west who served Sauron and hated the faithful of their former home. And again, like the Easterlings, battles and conquests against the newly established kingdoms, founded by the faithful of Númenor, cemented the realms of the south as realms of Sauron. To swell in numbers for his armies, to give their lives for his war against an enemy their ancestors loathed. And this darkness, originating from the east in the early years of man, spread like a plague across all of Middle-earth as men migrated and mingled. By the Second and Third Ages, men of darkness could be found in all corners. They built temples, some of great size, usually surrounded by dark trees, often in caverns, natural or delved, in secret valleys of mountain regions, such as the dreadful halls and passages under the haunted mountain beyond the Dark Door, Gate of the Dead, in Dunharrow. Others descended from the Northmen and became men of the mountains, dwelling in peaks and vales of the White Mountains far from realms of Easterlings or Haradrim, though still worshipping the same Dark Lord. They were no less cruel to other men, and as they spread from the mountains over the years, some yet remained well into the late Second Age, worshipping the Dark Lord still. We can call them men of darkness, alongside hillmen who aligned themselves with the Witch King of Angmar in the Third Age, many of the men of Dunland who fought against the Rohirrim in service of Sauron, and even the fallen wizard Saruman in the Third Age. After the fall of Morgoth long ago in the First Age, men continued to be drawn into conflicts against other men, fueled by more and more hatred of them. They had journeyed to all corners, infiltrated great kingdoms, mingled with other groups, and there was no longer one force to deal with, one ideal or enemy. The darkness had truly spread. With the spread of wicked men across Middle-earth comes a new definition of men of darkness. Tolkien tells us that when Faramir speaks of high men, middle men, and men of darkness in the Two Towers, the evil forces he speaks of in the Third Age are those who show pure hostility to the kingdoms, those hostile to Gondor and Arnor when it existed. Morgoth's influence, and especially Sauron's influence, had led to a fanatical hatred. These weren't just men who fought against the West, the so-called high men of the West, but those who loathed it entirely. They were moved by something more than human greed for conquest and plunder, something that had drawn men west and continued to do so. The men of darkness were now those who held an inherent disgust and hatred for both Morgoth and Sauron's enemies, even becoming united together through that hatred. A hatred reaching a religious and zealous level, wishing for the utter defeat and destruction of those fighting against their god. The term did not distinguish between any differences in race, culture, or language in the Third Age. Even when the Dark Lords met their end across different periods of Middle-earth's history, the men of darkness were those who would still fight, who would still worship them in temples and hidden places. The corruption instigated by Morgoth and later nurtured by Sauron led fallen men to be involved in most, if not all, the major conflicts of Middle-earth in one way or another, pitting the race of men against each other. This is what is important to remember. The short lives of men mean that many were born into the worship of Dark Lords and into servitude, forced into conflict against ancient enemies they may never have met, blood feuds and vendettas against sworn enemies. It would have been almost unthinkable in the Third Age to think otherwise if born into these realms. Many were perhaps powerless to resist becoming fanatical, almost as if they saw it as part of their identity, it being in their blood since the days when Melkor was their lord. Like orcs, I think we should sympathise with those manipulated by Dark Lords, even with men of darkness. Gandalf the White says to the steward of Gondor, Denethor, that he pities the slaves of Sauron, and Samwise Gamgee laments his first sight of men battling against men, immediately pitying an unknown soldier drawn west to serve the will of a Dark Lord. A battle in the Third Age of Middle-earth showing that little had changed since the days of the first corruption of man. It was Sam's first view of a battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was, and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace.